Okay, Chapter 5, Externalities and the policy related to those. So we'll talk about a couple different things. We'll talk about externalities, and again, this relates to economic efficiency that we were talking about in the last chapter. And then we'll talk about solutions to these externalities, both private and government. And then the last section is the four categories of goods, which again, it's situations where we don't have the efficient quantity, and so that's why we're talking about here. So what is an externality? This is when someone other than the buyer or the seller, so someone that is external to the transaction, either bears part of the cost of this transaction or receives benefit. So the reason it's a problem is because we said that both the buyer and the seller weigh the cost and the benefits, and that's how we achieve equilibrium. But what we're saying now, there's either costs, so the buyer is looking at the benefit they receive, the seller is looking at the cost. And so the seller makes their decisions based on their internal cost, but we're saying there's somebody other than the seller who's bearing part of the cost of this that's not factored in, or somebody other than the buyer that's receiving benefit. So the buyer is only looking at their benefit, they're not looking at the total benefit. And so what causes this is almost always a lack of property rights. Um, so pollution's when we talk about nobody owns the air, and so or nobody owns the water or whatever it is. So we tend to and we'll kind of look at this because that is part of the key to the solution is knowing how we got in this situation in the first place. So what we have here is the private cost is just the cost, say the production cost of the firm, the total cost that they do. But if there's somebody else, the social cost is this private cost plus any external costs. So if somebody else is bearing part of the cost of this transaction, the social cost is what it costs them to produce it plus any cost that somebody else is paying. So let's say we're talking about pollution. That's a common example. And let's say they're causing the air so polluted that it's causing health problems to people that aren't even these people's customers. So then it would be the cost of all those health problems plus that firm's private cost to produce. If it's benefit, again, the benefit is the benefit received by the consumer is the private one. Benefit received by the consumer. And then the social benefit, the total, so the social is really like the total, is the private benefit plus any external benefit. If somebody else benefited other than the buyer, that would be included when we get to the social benefit. So, negative externalities. A negative externality is when the social cost or the total is greater than the private cost. That means somebody else is bearing part of the cost. The result is that they are producing too much. They are producing beyond the economically efficient amount. Examples of negative externalities, they talk about pollution a lot in the book. Secondhand smoke is another one. Uh, somebody outside the buyer and the seller is bearing part of the cost of this transaction. If I breathe in smoke and it damages my lungs and I have health problems because of that, I wasn't either the buyer or the seller in the transaction, but I still had a cost here. So, but there's other ones in here, drug dealers. So if my neighbor is dealing drugs, that brings all kinds of unwanted traffic to this neighborhood. So here's a real example. There's somebody in my neighborhood that I'm pretty sure was dealing drugs, and somebody tried to break in, but they got the wrong house. And so here's this couple with their new baby just sitting there chilling, watching TV, 8 o'clock at night, somebody busts down the door and holds them at gunpoint. They thought they were breaking into a drug dealer's house, but they were not. Um, so that's a horrible cost to everybody in the neighborhood because now nobody feels safe. And we weren't either the buyer or the seller in that transaction, but everybody around was affected by that. So that's a negative externality. Other things like a barking dog. Um, if my neighbor gets a dog and leaves it outside and it barks all night long, I'm not the buyer or the seller in the transaction, but yet I am bearing part of the cost for their decision. Reckless driving. If I um, if I decide to drive recklessly, going it's my car and I don't care if I wreck it or not, but I cause an accident on the interstate, and now everybody's backed up for hours. Other people could be involved in the accident, and so it's a really high cost, even if just things are all backed up. Other people are bearing part of the cost for that decision. Property neglect. Um, if I had these friends and they were trying to sell their house, but the people across, it was all run down and it was just tons of abandoned cars parked in their yard all over the place. And so the property value went down on my friend's house. They couldn't get anybody to buy the house because they come to look at it and they see this across the street and they don't want to do it. So other people are affected by this transaction besides just, it's not just you and your house. So there's all kinds of examples, and some of them, you don't think of as like monetary, like the barking dog, but there is still a cost. So this is what it looks like on a graph. So when buyers and sellers, a firm just looks at their private cost, and then here's the demand. So if they only have to bear their private cost, they would come up right here. And so this is pollution or whatever. But because other people are bearing part of the cost, when they factor in, if the supply curve represents their costs, they're not factoring in all the costs. They're just factoring in the monetary cost that they had to pay. If they had to factor in the cost to everybody, they would their costs would be higher. And we know that input costs are one of the factors of supply. So I don't know, it shouldn't be going up, it should be going left, right? Left, right? So anyway, so if they had to bear the full cost, they would be producing less. Their input costs would be higher, they would be producing less. And so this would reflect the total cost of it. So this is usually what happens because they're really only looking at their out-of-pocket costs. If they had to factor in the full cost to society, or the full cost to the society, that it would be, the supply would be back here. We would only be producing this much. So we would go from A to B. And so again, up here at A, they're producing too much. This is how much they're producing. So really, this is kind of where we are, and this is really where we should be, or where we would be if all costs were considered. So this is how much we're producing. This is how much we should be producing. If all costs and benefits were considered in this transaction, we would only be producing this much. So this deadweight loss is what is the cost, the loss benefit if we're up here at A. Okay, we want to be at B. If we're at A, that area is deadweight loss because we're producing too much of it. There's also such things as positive externalities. And so positive externalities, when the social benefit is greater, or the total benefit is greater than the private benefit. Somebody outside this transaction is benefiting. What that means is, because we're not factoring the full benefit, there's not enough of it is being demanded, and so consumption is too low. Examples, they do education in there. So the more educated society is, you might factor in your decision to get a college education or not based on you would just look at your private benefit, so versus the cost. So here's the cost of going to school versus, here's the benefit to me, which is probably going to be higher wages in the future. But other people benefit from that as well. If you are more qualified, you might start a company and end up creating jobs for other people. Or there's lots of evidence to show that the more educated, the more highly educated society is, the lower the crime rate is, and there's all kinds of other benefits. So you're making a decision based on just your personal benefit, but the fact is other people are going to benefit as well. If you factored in those, then even more of this would be demanded. Another example is vaccines or flu shots. If I get my kid vaccinated for smallpox, I look at the cost versus the benefit. I don't want my kid to get sick. But who does anybody else benefit from that? Yeah, I send my kid to school, and now the fact that she doesn't have smallpox means she's not spreading it to anybody else. The same thing with the flu shot. If I get my kid a flu shot, then other people benefit because people are not getting the flu. Along that same line, you could say staying home when you're sick. When you are looking at I'm sick, should I stay home or not? You're looking at the cost versus the benefit to you, right? Like using up your sick time versus the benefit of staying home. But the fact is, if you and you could look at on going to work sick. There's negative externalities, right? You looked at the cost and the benefit and said I'm just going to go, but then you end up making 3 other people sick, and so staying home sick when you're sick can be a positive externality. Going to work when you're sick can be a negative externality. Other people are affected by that decision. You could look at other things like good driving instead of the reckless driving, right? Or let's say property upkeep. So some of these you can see are kind of the opposite of what we looked at in the negative externalities. National defense is another one. So national defense is paid for by tax dollars, but even people who don't pay taxes are still get national defense or police or that kind of stuff. So even people who don't chip in are still protected by that. If I plant a beautiful garden, I do it, I look at the time and the money involved in it versus the benefit, but other people benefit. My neighbors get to look at the beautiful garden. People that walk by get to look at the beautiful garden. Those people that put up like these really elaborate Christmas light displays, that's another one. They look at the cost and the benefit, but who gets to benefit? All these other people get to benefit by looking at that. So those are all examples of positive externalities. And we look at it this way. So people make their decision based on just their private benefit. And so they say, all right, and so we end up at this market equilibrium. But really, if you factored in the total benefit, the demand would be higher. And again, I hate the way they put it up. If you look at, if I factored in just not what I would benefit for, but what other people would benefit for as well, then the demand would be out here, and we would end up at this. So we would have, so with this one, this is what we're producing, but this is too low, right? We should be producing and consuming this much. If we're at the market equilibrium, this is the amount of our dead weight loss because not enough of this is being produced and consumed. So if there are externalities, either positive or negative, the market has achieved equilibrium, but not at the efficient quantity, okay? With a negative externality, there's too much. With a positive externality, there's not enough. So this is an example of market failure. So market failure isn't when the stock market falls, it's when the market, the supply and demand factors fail to produce the efficient level of output. So then we have to say, all right, how can we fix this? All right. So how can we correct this? How can we get the market to the efficient point? And really, it's about a lot of it is about trying to internalize those external costs and benefits. We're trying to get the buyers to have to absorb the full cost, or to get the consumers to recognize the full benefit. So there's 2 different ways. One solution is a private solution, okay? And this is all about property rights. So in this example, suppose a farmer and a paper mill share a stream. Nobody owns the water, okay? So the water goes from my property to your property. Nobody owns the water. So the paper mill will discharge waste into the stream, but that means when it runs downstream to the farmer, this water is now polluted. He can't use it. He can't let his animals use it. So if the farmer, and again, the lack of property rights here is the problem because no one owns the stream. If the farmer owned the stream, he could say, all right, I forbid you from discharging into my water. Or he could say, I'll let you discharge, but you got to pay me because maybe he's going to, it would cost him $3,000 to clean up the water. And so he charges them, a little bit more than that to make it worth it for him. Or he could do something else, but that would cost him, so he would want the money to make up for that. So either way, he becomes satisfied with the situation. They reach an efficient thing that they can both live with. It could work the opposite, and the mill could own the stream, own the water, which means if the farmer doesn't like the pollution in the water, he could pay them not to pollute in it. Okay, so either it doesn't really matter whether the firm or the farmer owns the water, as long as it's clear who owns it, they can work out an agreement for an acceptable level of pollution, whether that's zero or a lot or something in between. They can work that out among themselves. This is the idea behind the Case theorem. So Ronald Case said if transaction costs are low, private bargaining can come to an efficient solution. Okay, that does not necessarily mean that it's going to eliminate the pollution, but it's going to come to a point where they can both agree. They both settled on, like let's say in this one, the farmer allows them to pollute a certain amount for a fee. That's because what he's saying is that clean water is worth less to him, or completely pure water is worth less to him than some sort of fee over here. So we've brought it to an efficient point because we let them bargain. In order for that to happen, though, the property rights have to be clearly defined. The transaction costs have to be low. It has to be easy for these guys to kind of work this out, and full information has to be disclosed to all parties. So if it's just two parties like this one, it probably could work. But when it gets bigger, number one, getting the information to everybody. Number two, getting everyone to agree. It could be really, really complicated. Like, for instance, that's why this would never work for, say, the ozone layer that applies to the whole planet. So there are some situations where this can work. And again, it's about both people working out their costs and benefits, which means that both parties have to understand their costs and benefits. So this can work on a small scale, like with the stream and the farmer. They could probably work that out as long as somebody came along and said, "Here's who owns the water." That's the part that has to happen. Sometimes, though, and in a lot of cases, this is not going to work. Either the transaction costs are too high, the information's not readily available or agreed upon, or we can't define the property rights. In that case, the private solutions won't work, and you need government solutions.